Fan sells all possessions to see George Strait, 20 years ago. Now the king of country learns the truth and does something no one expected. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nashville streets as Johnny Pearson adjusted his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of Route 23's city bus, the same hands that once strummed a guitar with dreams bigger than the Texas sky. At 45, those dreams had long since faded into the rhythm of daily routes, passenger complaints, and the constant hum of George Strait's voice flowing through his earbuds during breaks. Johnny had been driving this route for 7 years now, watching the same faces board and exit at the same stops, their lives seemingly moving forward, while his remained frozen in a moment of regret that happened 20 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days helping people reach their destinations, while he himself had been stuck at the same emotional crossroads since 2003. "Morning, Mr. Pearson," called out Mrs. Henderson, a regular passenger whose arthritic hands always struggled with the fare box. Johnny had memorized her routine. She boarded at 8th and Broadway every Tuesday and Thursday for her physical therapy appointments, always carrying the same worn leather purse and always apologizing for taking too long to find exact change. "Take your time, Mrs. Henderson," Johnny replied with genuine warmth, the kind that came from understanding what it meant to move through life carrying invisible burdens. "We're right on schedule today." As the bus pulled away from the curb, Johnny caught his reflection in the side mirror. The face looking back at him showed every one of his 45 years, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and choices that couldn't be undone. His brown hair, once thick and unruly like his father's, now showed generous streaks of gray that he'd stopped trying to hide. But his eyes, those hazel eyes that his mother used to say could charm the birds from the trees, those still held a spark of something. Hope, maybe, or perhaps just stubborn refusal to give up completely. The truth was, Johnny Pearson had been living 2 lives for the past 2 decades. There was the life everyone could see, the reliable bus driver who never missed a shift, who knew every passenger's story, who volunteered to work holidays so his colleagues could spend time with their families. Then there was the life he carried inside, the one where a young man from Amarillo, Texas, had once believed that music could save souls and that following your heart was always the right choice, even when it led you away from everything you were supposed to protect. If you're enjoying this story and finding yourself curious about how Johnny's past will collide with his present, we'd love to have you join our community. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what you think will happen next. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts as this incredible journey unfolds. The radio crackled to life, dispatching him to his next pickup at the Bridgestone Arena. As Johnny navigated through downtown traffic, his mind wandered to the small apartment he'd called home for the past 5 years. The walls were lined with country music memorabilia, concert tickets, album covers, photographs from shows he'd attended over the years, but prominently displayed above his modest television was a framed ticket stub from April 15, 2003. The most expensive piece of paper he'd ever owned, and the one that had cost him everything that truly mattered. The apartment was quiet most evenings, filled only with the sounds of classic country flowing from his old stereo system. Johnny had learned to cook simple meals for one, had mastered the art of doing laundry in small loads, had become comfortable with conversations that consisted mainly of exchanges with grocery store clerks and gas station attendants. It wasn't the life he'd envisioned as a young man, but it was the life his choices had earned him. Sometimes, usually late at night when sleep eluded him, Johnny would take out his phone and stare at the contact information he'd managed to find 3 years ago. Sarah Pearson, now Sarah Mitchell, lived just 40 minutes away in Brentwood, working as a music producer for a mid-level record label. She'd remarried 8 years after their divorce to a man named David, who, from what Johnny could gather through careful internet searches, was everything Johnny had never been. Stable, predictable, present. But it was the other name in his phone's contact list that kept him awake most nights. Emily Mitchell, 20 years old, a junior at Belmont University studying music business. Her social media profiles, which Johnny checked with the dedication of a detective and the guilt of a stalker, showed a young woman with his hazel eyes and Sarah's determined chin. She played guitar, posted videos of herself covering classic country songs with a voice that was pure honey over gravel. She had his musical ear and her mother's business sense, and she was everything Johnny had given up the right to know. The bus stopped at a red light, and Johnny found himself studying the families walking down the sidewalk. A father pushed a stroller, while his wife pointed at something in a store window, both of them laughing at whatever their toddler was babbling about. Johnny's chest tightened with the familiar ache of wondering what moments like that might have felt like. Would Emily have inherited his love for early morning fishing trips? Would she have learned to play guitar sitting on his knee the way he'd learned from his own father? Would she have rolled her eyes at his terrible dad jokes the way Sarah used to? These were questions that had no answers, only the echo of a choice made in a moment of selfish desperation 20 years ago. Johnny had told himself countless times that he'd sold those precious items, his father's guitar, his wedding ring, his grandfather's watch, for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But deep in his heart, he knew the truth was simpler and more damaging. He'd chosen a fantasy over reality, chosen a moment of personal fulfillment over a lifetime of responsibility. The light turned green, and Johnny pressed the accelerator, guiding the bus through the familiar streets of a city that had become his refuge and his prison. Nashville was full of dreamers who'd come chasing music, and Johnny had learned to spot them easily. They had the same look in their eyes that he'd once carried, the same certainty that their passion was worth any sacrifice. He wanted to warn them sometimes, wanted to tell them that dreams without wisdom could become nightmares, that love without responsibility could destroy the very thing you were trying to protect. As the bus approached the arena, Johnny noticed an unusual gathering near the employee entrance. Several black SUVs with tinted windows were parked along the curb, and men in dark suits spoke quietly into their earpieces. It wasn't unusual for country music stars to use the arena for rehearsals or private events, but something about this particular scene made Johnny's pulse quicken. He'd developed an instinct for recognizing when someone important was in the building. The extra security, the carefully managed chaos, the way even the maintenance workers moved with more purpose. "Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity today," commented Jerry Martinez, a construction worker who'd been riding Johnny's route for 2 years. Jerry always sat in the third seat on the right side and always had an opinion about everything happening in the city. "Wonder who it could be. Maybe that new pop star, what's her name?" Johnny nodded non-committally, but his heart was doing something strange in his chest. There was a black cowboy hat visible through one of the SUV windows, and even from this distance, even after all these years, Johnny recognized the silhouette that had dominated his dreams and his regrets for 2 decades. It couldn't be. George Strait rarely did private appearances anymore, and when he did, they were usually in Texas or Las Vegas, not Nashville, on a random Thursday morning in October. But as the bus pulled to a complete stop and Johnny opened the doors, he caught a glimpse of something that made his breath catch in his throat. A man in a discreet black suit was holding what looked like a tour schedule, and even upside down and from 30 feet away, Johnny could swear he saw the words Strait and Nashville printed in bold letters across the top. The afternoon passengers began boarding. Office workers heading home early, students with their backpacks and earbuds, elderly couples who rode the bus more for the company than the transportation. Johnny went through the motions of greeting each one, checking transfers, making small talk about the weather, but his mind was spinning with possibilities and memories that he'd spent years trying to suppress. Could it really be him? After all these years of following George Strait's career from a distance, of attending local tribute shows and cover band performances, of listening to every album release and reading every interview, was it possible that the man himself was less than 100 yards away? And if so, what did that mean? Was the universe finally offering Johnny a chance to close the circle that had been left open for 20 years? Or was it simply another cruel reminder of the choice that had defined and destroyed the best parts of his life? As Johnny pulled the bus away from the arena and continued his route, he found himself taking longer looks in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see those black SUVs following him. His hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel, and he had to consciously steady his breathing. 20 years of carefully constructed emotional stability were threatening to crumble over what might have been nothing more than his imagination and wishful thinking. But deep in his gut, in the same place where he'd felt the pull toward that concert in Austin all those years ago, Johnny Pearson knew that this ordinary Thursday afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. Something was stirring in the carefully controlled world he'd built around his regrets, something that felt like possibility, mixed with terror, like hope seasoned with the fear of having to face the consequences of choices he'd never stopped wishing he could undo. The next stop was coming up, 5th and Union, where the afternoon shift workers caught the bus home to their families. Johnny could see them gathering at the bus stop, checking their phones, adjusting their work bags, preparing for the journey home to dinners and homework help and bedtime stories. The life he'd given up for a 3-hour concert was playing out right in front of him, in the faces of people who'd made different choices, better choices, choices that led to something more lasting than the memory of a perfect song played under arena lights. As the bus slowed to a stop, Johnny's radio crackled again with instructions for his final route of the day. But something in the dispatcher's voice was different, urgent in a way that suggested this wasn't going to be just another routine pickup. And in the distance, barely visible through the afternoon haze, Johnny could swear he saw one of those black SUVs making a U-turn and heading in the same direction his bus was supposed to go. The memory hit Johnny like a physical blow as he guided the bus through downtown Nashville, the same way it had been hitting him every day for 20 years. It always started the same way, with the sound of George Strait's voice singing Amarillo by Morning on the radio, and then everything else would flood back like a dam bursting open. It was March of 2003, and Johnny had been staring at the computer screen in the cramped office of Patterson's Auto Parts for what felt like hours. The announcement had appeared on George Strait's official website that morning. A special acoustic performance in Austin, Texas on April 15th, limited seating, intimate venue, the kind of show that happened maybe once in a decade, the kind that would be talked about for generations among true country music fans. "You've been staring at that screen for 20 minutes, his co-worker Mike had said, leaning over Johnny's shoulder. "Either buy the damn ticket or close the browser. You're making me nervous with all that heavy breathing." Johnny had laughed, but his heart wasn't in it. The ticket price was $350, more money than he'd ever spent on anything that wasn't an absolute necessity. And then there was the drive to Austin, at least 500 miles from their little house in Amarillo, which meant gas money, hotel money, maybe food money if he wanted to eat something other than gas station snacks. "Sarah's gonna kill me," Johnny had muttered, but his finger was already hovering over the purchase button. "Sarah's 6 months pregnant with your first kid," Mike had reminded him, not unkindly. Maybe this isn't the time for grand gestures, you know? But that was exactly the problem. Johnny could feel time closing in around him, could sense that his days of grand gestures and spontaneous adventures were numbered. Soon there would be diapers and daycare costs, sleepless nights and Saturday morning soccer games. There would be a time when spending $350 on a concert ticket would be not just irresponsible, but impossible. The house he and Sarah rented sat on the outskirts of Amarillo, a small 2-bedroom place with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. It wasn't much, but they'd made it home with second-hand furniture and dreams bigger than their bank account. Sarah had painted the nursery a soft yellow since they'd decided to be surprised about the baby's gender, and she'd spent weeks arranging and rearranging the crib and changing table that Johnny had assembled with more enthusiasm than skill. "How was work?" Sarah had asked that evening, the way she asked every evening, looking up from the accounting textbooks spread across their kitchen table. She was taking night classes at the community college, determined to build a stable career before the baby arrived. Even 6 months pregnant, she was the most focused person Johnny had ever known. "Same as always," Johnny had replied, kissing the top of her head and inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Mike says the Pattersons might expand next year, maybe need another full-time mechanic." Sarah had smiled, the kind of smile that made Johnny remember why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She was pretty in an understated way, with light brown hair that she wore in a practical ponytail and blue eyes that seemed to see right through whatever front he was trying to put up. But more than that, she was solid, dependable, the kind of person who made lists and stuck to budgets and never bought anything without thinking about it for at least a week. "That would be wonderful," she'd said, placing her hand on her rounded belly. "Little one here is going to need all the stability we can provide." Johnny had nodded and agreed, but something inside him had twisted with what felt like panic. Stability was a good thing, he knew that. Stability was what responsible adults provided for their families. But stability also felt like a door closing, like the last traces of the dreamer he'd once been getting buried under layers of practical concerns and realistic expectations. That night, After Sarah had fallen asleep with one hand resting on her belly and her accounting book still open beside her, Johnny had crept out to the living room and opened his laptop. The George Strait concert page was still bookmarked in his browser, still showing the same tantalizing details about what promised to be a legendary performance. He'd started doing math in his head, the kind of desperate calculations that people make when they're trying to justify something they know they shouldn't do. His wedding ring was worth maybe $200 if he sold it to the right person. His father's guitar, the one piece of his dad he'd managed to keep after the funeral, had been appraised at $400 3 years ago. His graduation watch, the one his grandfather had given him when he finished high school, was probably worth another $150. Johnny had told himself he was just exploring options, just seeing what was theoretically possible. He wasn't actually going to sell his most precious possessions to attend a concert. He was a 25-year-old man with a pregnant wife and responsibilities. He was better than that. But as the days passed and the concert date grew closer, something inside Johnny began to shift. He'd catch himself staring at that guitar case in their bedroom closet, remembering the last time his father had played it before. The cancer made his fingers too weak to form chords. He'd find himself twisting his wedding ring while he worked, thinking about how it was really just a symbol, and symbols couldn't pay for concert tickets. The breaking point came on April 10th, 5 days before the show. Johnny had been listening to George Strait's greatest hits on his way home from work when Amarillo by Morning came on the radio. It was the song his father had taught him to play, the first song they'd ever performed together at the local Honky Tonks open mic night. As George's voice filled the cab of his pickup truck, singing about rodeos and dreams and the endless Texas sky, Johnny felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd driven straight to Murphy's pawn shop without stopping at home first. "You sure about this, son?" Murphy had asked, examining the guitar with the careful eye of someone who'd seen too many people make desperate decisions. "This is a beautiful instrument, probably worth more to you than I can give you for it." "I'm sure," Johnny had lied, his hands shaking as he signed the paperwork. The wedding ring had been easier to part with somehow. Murphy had barely looked up when Johnny slid it across the counter, just weighed it, and named a price that was exactly what Johnny needed to make his math work out. The watch had been the hardest part, not because of its monetary value, but because Johnny could still remember his grandfather's hands as they'd fastened it around his wrist 7 years earlier. "Take care of yourself, boy," his grandfather had said that day, "and remember that time is the most valuable thing you'll ever own. Don't waste it on things that don't matter." Standing in Murphy's pawn shop, holding $650 in cash and feeling like he'd just sold pieces of his soul, Johnny wondered if his grandfather would consider a once-in-a-lifetime concert to be a waste of time, or if he'd understand that sometimes a man needs to grab hold of something beautiful before it disappears forever. The drive home had felt like the longest 10 minutes of his life. Sarah's car was in the driveway, which meant she was home from her evening class. The porch light was on, and he could see the soft glow of the television through their living room curtains. It looked like peace. It looked like home. It looked like everything he was about to risk for 3 hours of music. "How was class?" he'd asked when he walked through the front door, trying to keep his voice casual. "Good," Sarah had replied, but there was something in her tone that made Johnny look up from where he was hanging his jacket. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over her pregnant belly, and her expression was unreadable. "Got an interesting phone call about an hour ago." Johnny's blood had turned to ice water in his veins. "Oh yeah? Murphy called. Said he wanted to make sure I knew you'd been in to sell some things. Said he always likes to check with both spouses when someone's selling wedding jewelry, just to avoid any misunderstandings." The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours. Johnny could hear the tick of the clock on the mantel, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. Sarah's eyes were fixed on his face, and he could see the exact moment when understanding and disappointment crashed over her like a wave. "Tell me you didn't," she'd whispered. But Johnny couldn't tell her that, because he had. He'd sold their history, their security, their trust, all for a concert ticket, and the selfish dream of 3 perfect hours where he could pretend his life was still full of infinite possibilities. And as he stood there in their living room, with $650 burning a hole in his pocket and his wife's heart breaking right in front of him, Johnny Pearson began to understand that some choices couldn't be undone, and some dreams came with a price that was far too high to pay. The fight that followed was unlike anything they'd ever experienced in their 2 years of marriage. Sarah had always been the calm one, the voice of reason when Johnny's emotions ran too hot or too fast. But that night, standing in their small living room with her hands protectively covering her swollen belly, she'd unleashed a fury that Johnny had never seen before. "Your father's guitar, Johnny?" Her voice had cracked on the words. "The one thing you had left of him, and you sold it for what, for a concert ticket?" "It's not just any concert," Johnny had tried to explain, knowing even as the words left his mouth how pathetic they sounded. "This is George Strait, Sarah. This might be the only chance I ever get to see him perform like this. And what about our chance?" Sarah's eyes were filling with tears, but her voice was steel. "What about our baby's chance to have a father who puts his family first? What about my chance to have a husband who doesn't sell his wedding ring the moment he wants something more than he wants us?" Johnny had reached for her then, but Sarah had stepped back as if his touch might burn her. The physical distance between them felt like a chasm opening up, and Johnny realized with growing horror that he might have just destroyed the best thing in his life for the sake of a fantasy. "I can get it all back," he'd said desperately. "After the concert, I'll find a way to buy everything back. The guitar, the ring, your grandfather's watch. I promise, Sarah." "With what money, Johnny?" Sarah had laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "With the money we don't have for the baby. With the money we need for health insurance and crib sheets and 1,000 other things that are more important than your need to relive your teenage dreams." The argument had continued deep into the night, circling through the same points over and over again. Johnny trying to make Sarah understand that this wasn't about abandoning his family. It was about holding on to the last piece of who he used to be before responsibility swallowed him whole. Sarah trying to make Johnny see that becoming a father meant making sacrifices, meant choosing love over selfishness, meant being the kind of man their child could look up to. "I'm scared," Sarah had finally whispered, sometime around 2 in the morning, when they were both exhausted from fighting and crying and trying to find common ground that seemed to have disappeared entirely. "I'm scared that this is who you really are, Johnny. Someone who will always choose what he wants over what we need." "That's not who I am," Johnny had insisted, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "Then don't go," Sarah had said simply. "Prove to me that I'm wrong. Take the money back to Murphy tomorrow and buy our things back. Show me that your family means more to you than a 3-hour concert." Johnny had stared at her across their darkened bedroom, seeing the woman he'd fallen in love with, the mother of his unborn child, the person who'd believed in him when no one else did. He'd opened his mouth to say yes, to promise that he'd return the money and cancel his plans and be the man she needed him to be. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep in his heart, Johnny knew that if he didn't go to this concert, if he didn't take this one chance to touch something magical and extraordinary, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. He would become bitter and resentful, always looking back at the opportunity he'd let slip away. And eventually, that bitterness would poison their marriage anyway. "I have to go, Sarah," he'd whispered into the darkness. "I can't explain it in a way that will make sense to you, but I have to go." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Johnny had ever heard. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Then I can't be here when you get back." Johnny had left for Austin at dawn on April 15th, driving through the Texas countryside with a heart that felt like it was being torn in half. Sarah hadn't spoken to him that morning, hadn't even looked at him as he'd gathered his things and headed for the door. She'd sat at their kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring out the window at nothing. The drive had taken 8 hours, 8 hours of second-guessing and self-doubt, and a growing certainty that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But every time Johnny thought about turning around, about going home and begging Sarah's forgiveness, he'd remember his father's voice singing "Amarillo by Morning" in their old pickup truck, and he'd press harder on the accelerator. The concert venue in Austin was smaller than Johnny had expected, an intimate theater that seated maybe 800 people. As he'd walked through the doors with his ticket clutched in his sweating palm, Johnny had felt like he was entering a sacred space. The other fans around him had the same look of reverent anticipation that he felt burning in his chest, the same understanding that they were about to witness something special. When George Strait had walked onto that stage, wearing a simple white shirt and black jeans, carrying his guitar with the casual confidence of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years, Johnny had felt tears sting his eyes. This was why he'd come. This was what Sarah couldn't understand. It wasn't just about the music. It was about connection, about feeling less alone in a world that seemed designed to crush dreams and settle for ordinary. For 3 hours, Johnny had lost himself completely in the magic of live music. George had played all the classics, told stories between songs, and created an atmosphere of intimacy that made every person in that theater feel like they were sitting in his living room. When he'd launched into Amarillo by morning, Johnny had found himself on his feet with everyone else, singing along to words that felt like they'd been written specifically for moments like this. And then, impossibly, it had happened. During the final verse of the song, as Johnny sang with everything he had in him, George Strait had looked directly at him. Their eyes had met across the crowded theater, and George had smiled and tipped his hat in Johnny's direction. It had lasted maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, Johnny had felt completely understood, completely seen, completely vindicated in his decision to be there. The drive home had been very different from the drive to Austin. Johnny had been high on the memory of those 3 perfect hours, replaying every song and every moment in his mind, already planning how he'd describe the experience to Sarah. She'd still be angry, he knew, but once she saw how much this had meant to him, once she understood that he'd needed this to be the kind of husband and father she deserved, she'd forgive him. But when Johnny had pulled into their driveway at 2 in the morning on April 16th, the house had been dark and eerily quiet. Sarah's car was gone from its usual spot, and there was an envelope taped to the front door with his name written on it in her careful handwriting. Johnny had known before he opened it what the letter would say, but reading the words had still felt like being punched in the stomach. Sarah had gone to stay with her sister in Dallas. She needed time to think about their marriage, time to figure out if she could trust him to be the kind of partner she needed, the kind of father their child deserved. She would call him when she was ready to talk, but until then, she needed space. The house had felt like a tomb. Johnny had wandered from room to room, seeing evidence of the life they'd built together, and realizing how fragile it had all been. Sarah's coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it that morning. The nursery door was closed, but Johnny could picture the yellow walls and the carefully arranged furniture, waiting for a baby who might never know his father. That night, sitting alone in their bedroom and staring at the empty spot on the dresser where his father's guitar case used to sit, Johnny had finally understood the true cost of his choice. He'd traded his marriage, his family, his future, for 3 hours of perfect music and a moment of imagined connection with a man who didn't even know his name. 1 week later, Sarah had called to tell him she was filing for divorce. 2 months after that, Emily Rose Pearson had been born, weighing 7 pounds and 6 ounces with her father's hazel eyes and her mother's determined chin. Johnny had learned about his daughter's birth from a mutual friend, and he'd sat in his empty house and cried for everything he'd lost and would never be able to reclaim. Now, 20 years later, driving his bus through the streets of Nashville and remembering every painful detail of those life-altering weeks, Johnny could still feel the weight of that choice pressing down on his chest. The concert had been everything he'd hoped it would be and more, but the cost had been everything he'd ever actually loved, and no amount of perfect music could fill the hole that loss had carved in his heart. The radio dispatcher's voice crackled through again, pulling Johnny back to the present with instructions for his final pickup of the day. Route 23, we need you to swing by the Hermitage Hotel. Special passenger pickup, VIP treatment requested. Johnny frowned at the unusual request. In 7 years of driving for Metro Transit, he'd never been asked to provide VIP treatment for anyone. Bus drivers didn't do VIP. They did reliable, punctual, and courteous, but they didn't roll out red carpets or cater to celebrities who could afford their own transportation. Copy that dispatch, Johnny replied, though his confusion was evident in his voice. ETA 15 minutes. As he navigated toward the historic Hermitage Hotel, Johnny's mind wandered to what he knew about his ex-wife's current life. Through the careful stalking that divorced parents called staying informed, he'd learned that Sarah had built quite a reputation for herself in Nashville's music industry. Sarah Mitchell of Blackbird Productions had a client roster that included several up-and-coming country artists, and her name appeared in the credits of albums that actually mattered in the industry. More importantly, and more painfully, Sarah had raised their daughter to be everything Johnny had dreamed she might become. Emily Mitchell was a junior at Belmont University, studying music business with a minor in performance. Her Instagram account, which Johnny checked with the dedication of a detective and the guilt of a stalker, showed a young woman who was confident, talented, and completely unaware that her biological father drove a city bus 12 miles from her dorm room. Emily played guitar with a skill that made Johnny's chest tight with recognition and pride. She covered classic country songs with a voice that carried both power and vulnerability, posting videos from her dorm room that regularly garnered hundreds of comments from friends and strangers alike. Last month, she'd posted a video of herself playing Amarillo by Morning, and Johnny had watched it 17 times before, forcing himself to close the browser. The most painful part wasn't just that Emily existed without knowing him. It was that she clearly loved music the way he always had, with the kind of passion that made everything else seem secondary. She had his musical instincts and Sarah's business sense, and she was building the kind of career that Johnny had once dreamed of having. She was everything he might have been if he'd made different choices, everything he'd given up the right to guide or support or celebrate. As Johnny pulled up to the Hermitage Hotel, he was surprised to see the same black SUVs from the arena parked along the curb. The men in dark suits were still there, still speaking quietly into their earpieces, still managing whatever carefully choreographed event was taking place. Johnny's heart did that strange jumping thing again as he realized that his final passenger of the day might be connected to whatever celebrity presence had been haunting his peripheral vision all afternoon. A woman emerged from the hotel lobby, and Johnny's entire world tilted sideways. Even after 20 years, even with the professional haircut and expensive clothes, even with the confidence that came from success and remarriage and a life well lived, he recognized Sarah immediately. She moved with the same purposeful stride he remembered, though now there was an additional layer of authority that spoke of someone who'd learned to navigate boardrooms and negotiate contracts. Behind Sarah walked a younger woman, and Johnny's hands began to shake on the steering wheel. Emily was taller than he'd expected, with long brown hair that caught the afternoon sunlight, and moved with an easy grace that reminded him painfully of Sarah at that age. But her eyes, even from a distance, Johnny could see that she had his hazel eyes, the same eyes that looked back at him every morning in the bathroom mirror. Sarah approached the bus with what looked like nervous determination, and when she climbed the steps and made eye contact with Johnny, 20 years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumbled in an instant. "Hello, Johnny," she said quietly, and her voice was exactly the same, still carrying that mix of strength and gentleness that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. "Sarah," Johnny's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand. How did you know I would be here?" Emily had boarded behind her mother, and she was looking at Johnny with curiosity rather than recognition. Why would she recognize him? She'd been born 2 months after he'd destroyed their family. She'd grown up with David Mitchell as her father, had probably never even seen a photograph of the man who'd contributed half her DNA and none of her upbringing. "This is going to sound impossible," Sarah said, settling into the front seat while Emily took the seat behind her. "But we need to talk, all of us, and we need to go to the Bridgestone Arena." Johnny stared at her in confusion. "Sarah, I'm working. I can't just drive my bus to the arena for a personal conversation. I have routes to complete, passengers to pick up." "Your supervisor has already cleared it," Sarah said, and there was something in her tone that suggested this entire situation was far more complicated than Johnny understood. "Johnny, there's someone who wants to meet you. Someone who knows about Austin, about the concert, about everything that happened 20 years ago." The blood drained from Johnny's face. In 2 decades, he'd never told anyone the complete truth about why his marriage had ended. He'd let people assume it was the usual reasons, grew apart, wanted different things, couldn't make it work. He'd never admitted to selling his wedding ring for a concert ticket, never confessed to choosing 3 hours of music over a lifetime with his family. "How?" Johnny managed to ask. "Because I told him," Sarah said simply. 3 days ago at a Music Row event, I had too much wine and ended up sitting next to a man who seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind the music industry. I told him about my ex-husband, about the fan who'd sacrificed everything to see George Strait perform, about how sometimes loving something too much can destroy everything else you love. Johnny's vision was beginning to blur around the edges. "You told a stranger about our marriage." "Johnny," Emily spoke for the first time, and her voice was soft and musical, exactly like Sarah's had been at 20. "The stranger was George Strait." The words hit Johnny like a physical blow. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white, and for a moment he thought he might actually pass out. George Strait knew about him. George Strait knew about the choice he'd made, about the family he'd destroyed, about the 20 years of regret that had followed. "He wants to meet me." Johnny's voice was barely audible. "He's waiting for us at the arena," Sarah said gently. "Johnny, there's more you need to know. About Emily. About what she's been doing, about why this conversation needed to happen now." Johnny looked in his rearview mirror at the daughter he'd never known, trying to process the impossible reality that she was sitting in his bus, that after 20 years of wondering about her from a distance, she was close enough to touch. She was beautiful in the understated way that Sarah had always been, but there was something else in her expression, something that looked like hope, mixed with nervous anticipation. "What about Emily?" Johnny asked. "She's been writing songs about you," Sarah said, and Johnny felt his heart stop entirely. "About the father she never knew, about the stories I told her growing up, about wondering what kind of man chooses music over family. She's been trying to understand you through her music, Johnny, and 3 months ago she wrote a song that George Strait heard and wants to record. The world was spinning too fast." Johnny tried to process what Sarah was telling him, that his daughter, the daughter he'd never met, had been writing songs about him, that somehow, impossibly, those songs had reached the ears of the man whose music had started this entire tragedy. "What kind of song?" Johnny whispered. Emily leaned forward, and when she spoke, Johnny could hear echoes of his own voice in hers, the same cadences he'd inherited from his father and passed on without knowing it. "It's called The Man Who Chose the Song," Emily said. "It's about forgiveness and understanding, and how sometimes people make terrible choices for reasons that feel important at the time. It's about a daughter who spent 20 years wondering if her father loved music more than he could have loved her." Johnny's vision blurred with tears he'd been holding back for 20 years. His daughter had been thinking about him, wondering about him, trying to understand him through the only language that had ever made sense to him, music, and somehow, through a series of coincidences that felt more like destiny, that music had reached the man who'd unwittingly been the catalyst for every loss Johnny had ever experienced. "Does he hate me?" Johnny asked, and he wasn't sure if he was talking about George Strait or his own daughter. "No," Emily said softly, "but he wants to understand. We all do, Dad." The word hit Johnny like lightning. Dad. She'd called him Dad, this beautiful stranger, who carried his eyes and his musical instincts and 20 years of questions he'd never been allowed to answer. And now, somehow, impossibly, they were all heading toward a conversation that Johnny had dreamed about and feared in equal measure for 2 decades. The drive to the Bridgestone Arena felt both endless and far too short. Johnny navigated through downtown Nashville traffic in a daze, hyper-aware of every breath his daughter took behind him, every glance Sarah cast in his direction. The city bus had never carried more precious cargo, and Johnny found himself driving with the careful precision of someone transporting fragile dreams. "I need you to know something before we get there," Emily said, breaking the charged silence that had settled over them. "I've been angry at you my whole life, angry at the idea of you anyway. Mom told me stories about how much you loved music, how you could play guitar by ear, how you knew every George Strait song by heart. But she also told me about the choice you made." Johnny's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd imagined this conversation countless times, but hearing his daughter's actual voice speaking these words was more painful than any fantasy he'd conjured. "I used to wonder what kind of man chooses a concert over his pregnant wife," Emily continued, and Johnny could hear both hurt and curiosity in her tone. "What kind of father sells his wedding ring to see a singer who doesn't even know he exists? For years I thought you must be selfish or weak, or just fundamentally broken somehow." Sarah reached back and squeezed Emily's hand, but she didn't interrupt. This was something Emily needed to say, something she'd apparently been carrying for 20 years. "But then I started playing music myself," Emily said. "Really playing. Not just strumming chords, but feeling the way a perfect song can reach inside you and touch something you didn't even know was there. And I began to understand that maybe it wasn't about choosing music over family. Maybe it was about choosing one moment of pure connection over a lifetime of wondering what might have been." Johnny's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away and focused on the road ahead. The arena was coming into view now, and he could see those familiar black SUVs arranged around the employee entrance like a protective barrier. "I wrote The Man Who Chose the Song because I wanted to understand you," Emily continued. "I wanted to figure out if love could be so big and overwhelming that it makes you do terrible things. And I think I finally get it, Dad. You didn't choose music over us. You chose yourself over us, which is different." You chose the man you used to be over the man you were supposed to become. The words should have felt like accusations, but somehow they felt like absolution. Emily understood, in a way that even Johnny himself had never been able to articulate, exactly what had driven him to make that devastating choice 20 years ago. "Does that make it right?" Johnny asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "No," Emily said gently, "but it makes it human." Johnny parked the bus in the employee lot, and as he turned off the engine, he realized that his hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in 20 years, he was about to face the full consequences of his actions, not just the regret and isolation he'd been living with, but the actual human cost of his choice, his wife, his daughter, the man whose music had unwittingly been the catalyst for everything that followed. Security personnel approached the bus as they disembarked, but they seemed to be expecting the unusual arrival of a city bus at the venue's employee entrance. Johnny was handed a visitor's badge and guided through corridors he'd never seen before, past equipment cases and soundboards and all the behind-the-scenes machinery that made the magic possible. They stopped outside a door marked "Private," and Johnny's escort knocked twice before opening it. The room beyond was simple and comfortable, set up like a living room with leather couches and soft lighting, and sitting in one of those chairs, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, was George Strait. At 71, George looked exactly like Johnny had imagined he would, weathered in the way that spoke of authenticity rather than age, with eyes that seemed to have seen everything and judged very little of it. He stood when they entered, and Johnny was struck by how ordinary the moment felt, how different it was from the fantasy encounters he'd imagined over the years. "Johnny Pearson," George said, extending his hand. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for 3 days now." Johnny shook the offered hand, amazed that his own wasn't trembling. "Mr. Strait, I don't know what Sarah told you, but I want you to know that what happened 20 years ago wasn't your fault. The choice I made, the way I destroyed my family, that was all me." George gestured for them to sit, and Johnny found himself on a couch between Sarah and Emily, facing the man whose music had provided the soundtrack to both the best and worst moments of his life. "Sarah told me about a young man who loved music so much that he sold everything he owned to attend one of my concerts," George said. "She told me about a fan who chose 3 hours of what he thought was connection over a lifetime of actual connection, and she told me about the 20 years of regret that followed." Johnny nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "What she didn't tell me," George continued, "was whether that young man ever forgave himself for the choice he made." "I don't think forgiveness is possible," Johnny said quietly. "Some mistakes are too big, some losses too permanent." "Maybe," George agreed. "But I've learned something in 50 years of making music, Johnny. The songs that matter most, the ones that really touch people, they're not the ones about perfect choices and happy endings. They're the ones about human beings doing human things, making mistakes, living with consequences, finding ways to keep going even when they've broken something that can't be fixed." Emily leaned forward, and Johnny could see tears in her eyes. "That's what my song is about, Mr. Strait. It's about understanding that people are complicated, that love can be destructive, that sometimes the thing that saves you is also the thing that destroys everything else." "I'd like to hear it," George said to Emily, then looked back at Johnny. "But first, I want you to know why I asked Sarah to arrange this meeting. It's not because I feel guilty about what my music inspired you to do. It's because I think you've spent 20 years punishing yourself for being human, and I think that's long enough." George stood and walked to a guitar case in the corner of the room. When he opened it, Johnny recognized the instrument immediately. It was the same model and make as his father's guitar, the one he'd sold to Murphy's pawn shop 20 years ago. "I want to offer you something, Johnny," George said, holding the guitar. "Not forgiveness, because that's not mine to give. Not a way to undo the past, because that's not possible, but maybe a way to build something new from the pieces of what was broken." Johnny stared at the guitar, not understanding what was being offered. "I want to invite you to work with my tour," George continued. "Nothing glamorous, equipment management, bus maintenance, the kind of behind-the-scenes work that keeps a tour running. It's honest work, it pays well, and it would give you a chance to be around music without having to carry the weight of what music once cost you." Johnny's vision blurred. "Mr. Strait, I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," George said firmly. "I've been watching you for 3 days, Johnny. I've seen how you treat people, how you show up for work, how you've built a life of service and reliability, even while carrying more guilt than any one person should have to bear. That's not charity. That's recognizing character. Sarah spoke up for the first time since they'd entered the room. There's more, Johnny. Emily's song. George wants to record it as a duet. With her. Johnny looked at his daughter, seeing the mixture of excitement and nervousness in her face. Your first recording is going to be with George Strait. If you give us your blessing, Emily said. The song is about you, Dad. About trying to understand the father I never knew. I can't sing it without knowing that you're okay with the world hearing your story. Johnny looked around the room at these three people who had somehow conspired to offer him something he'd never dared hope for. Not redemption, because some things couldn't be redeemed, but the chance to be useful, to be part of something larger than his regret, to have a relationship with the daughter who'd grown up wondering about him. There's one more thing, George said quietly. Tonight I'm doing a private show here at the arena, just a small audience, mostly industry people. I'd like you to be there, Johnny, all of you, and if you're willing, I'd like Emily to join me on stage for Amarillo by Morning, the song that started this whole story 20 years ago. Johnny's breath caught in his throat. The circle that had begun with his selfish choice in 2003 was being offered a chance to close, not with the erasure of consequences, but with the possibility of new beginnings built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom. Why would you do all this? Johnny asked. George smiled, and Johnny could see in that smile the same warmth that had made him fall in love with the man's music 30 years ago. Because 20 years ago, you made a choice that cost you everything. And tonight, maybe we can make some different choices. Together. As the evening approached and the small audience filed into the arena, Johnny found himself standing in the wings with Emily, watching her tune the guitar George had given her. Not his father's guitar returned, but a new instrument that represented new possibilities rather than recovered losses. Are you nervous? Johnny asked his daughter, amazed that he had the right to ask such a fatherly question. Terrified, Emily admitted, but also excited and grateful. Grateful for what? Emily looked at him with eyes that were exactly like his own, filled with understanding that had taken 20 years to develop. Grateful that you chose the song, Dad, because if you hadn't, I wouldn't be here. Not just born, but here. Understanding music the way you taught me to understand it, even though you were never there to teach me anything. When George called them onto the stage, and the opening chords of Amarillo by Morning filled the arena, Johnny stood behind his daughter as she sang about Texas skies and second chances, her voice blending perfectly with George's in harmonies that seemed to heal something broken in the universe itself. And as the song ended and the small audience erupted in applause, Johnny understood that some choices could never be undone, but new choices could always be made. The man who had chosen the song 20 years ago was gone, replaced by a father who was finally ready to choose his family, not over music, but alongside it, building a future that honored both his love for the art that had shaped him and the people who had shaped him even more.